Any sailor knows the distinct feeling when a ship starts moving the wrong way at the wrong moment. You feel the slide before you see it on the indicators. The bow is exactly where you want it, but the deck under your feet feels heavy and unresponsive. You watch the jackstaff shift against the background, and you realize the vessel is no longer following the rudder, but drifting sideways into danger. We were approaching the entrance to a commercial port on the western coast of Italy. The vessel was a Panamax bulk carrier fully loaded with grain, drawing about 13 meters. It was a standard afternoon arrival. The visibility was clear and the wind was moderate, blowing maybe Y force 4 from the northwest. The sea state was manageable with a low swell running perpendicular to the coast. On the bridge, the team consisted of the master, the third officer handling the telegraph and logbook, a quartermaster at the wheel, and the local pilot. The pilot had boarded 3 miles out. He was a man in his 60s, quiet and efficient. We had exchanged the pilot card and discussed the approach. The plan was straightforward. Enter between the 2 outer breakwaters, proceed roughly 5 cables, and then swing to port for the grain terminal. The entrance gap was about 300 meters wide. For a ship of our beam, this offered sufficient clearance, provided we stayed on the centerline. The chart showed a depth of 20 meters in the approach, shoaling to 15 just inside the harbor. We were running at slow ahead, making about 4 knots over the ground. The current was known to run south along the coast, crossing the harbor mouth. We had calculated a drift angle to compensate for this during the approach. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It helps this channel reach more sailors. The approach began normally. The pilot ordered a heading of 090 to counter the southerly set. The bow was steady. The distance to the breakwater heads decreased steadily. We could see the red light structure on the port hand and the green on the starboard. The vessel felt heavy, but stable in the water. This happened in 1998 on a routine commercial voyage. As the bow passed the line connecting the 2 breakwater heads, the dynamic changed. The forward section of the ship entered the calm, protected water inside the harbor. The water here was still. However, the aft section, the remaining 200 meters of the hull, was still outside, exposed to the southerly current and the swell. The effect was immediate and purely hydrodynamic. The bow, now in slack water, lost the side pressure from the current. The stern, still being pushed south by the current, continued to drift. This created a strong rotational force. The ship began to pivot around its center of flotation. The pilot noticed the movement on the rate of turn indicator first. The bow began swinging rapidly to port, towards the northern breakwater wall. The stern was swinging starboard, dangerously close to the southern breakwater head we were passing. "Starboard 10, the pilot said. His voice was level. "Starboard 10, the helmsman repeated. He turned the wheel and held it. I looked at the rudder angle indicator. It showed 10 degrees to starboard. I looked out the forward window. The jackstaff was still moving left against the backdrop of the port infrastructure. The swing to port was not checking. In fact, it seemed to be accelerating as the hull was subjected to 2 different water forces simultaneously. "Hard a starboard," the pilot ordered. The helmsman spun the wheel aggressively. "Hard a starboard, sir. Rudder is hard a starboard." We waited. In a loaded ship at slow speed, the rudder requires water flow to be effective. At 4 knots, with the engine turning slowly, the discharge current from the propeller was weak. The mass of the ship, 70,000 tons of cargo plus the steel, had significant momentum. The rotational inertia was building up. The bow was now pointing clearly at the concrete caissons of the northern breakwater. The master stepped forward to the centerline windows. He checked the distance to the breakwater. It was less than 2 cables ahead. The gap was narrowing. If the swing continued, the port bow would strike the breakwater, or the starboard quarter would scrape the southern entrance marker. "She is not answering," the master said calmly. The pilot nodded. He checked the rudder indicator again to confirm it was hard over. The ship was still swinging port. The heading marker on the radar confirmed the trend. The rate of turn was increasing. The calm water inside the harbor offered no resistance to the bow's swing, while the current outside continued to shove the stern. We needed more rudder authority. The only way to get that without a tug made fast was to increase the flow of water over the rudder blade. However, increasing speed in a confined harbor entrance is a calculated risk. If the rudder did not bite, we would simply hit the wall faster. "Half ahead," the pilot ordered. The third officer rang the telegraph. The engine room responded instantly. The RPM gauge climbed. We felt the vibration increase through the deck plates. The propeller churned the water, sending a wash against the hard-over rudder. For 10 seconds, nothing changed. The bow continued its drift to port. The angle of approach was becoming acute. We were no longer entering the harbor. We were sliding diagonally across the entrance. The distance to the northern wall dropped to 1 cable. The concrete blocks looked very large through the bridge windows. The vessel was crabbing. The center of the channel was behind us. We were drifting into the northern quadrant of the entrance. The pilot looked at the master. "Full ahead," the master suggested, anticipating the need for maximum thrust. "Full ahead," the pilot agreed. The telegraph was pushed to the stops. The engine load increased. We were now committing a large, heavy vessel to high power in a restricted space. If the rudder did not catch the water soon, the collision would be significant. The physics of the situation were simple. The turning moment from the current on the stern was currently stronger than the turning moment of the rudder. We had to reverse that balance before we ran out of water. The tension on the bridge was palpable, though the silence remained unbroken. The vibration from the main engine became a steady tremor throughout the bridge structure as the shaft speed reached the ordered setting. We were now applying maximum thrust in a channel designed for slow-speed maneuvering. The wash from the propeller was powerful, striking the rudder blade with significant force. However, the laws of physics involving a fully laden vessel are not easily overcome. The forward momentum of the ship began to increase, but the rotational momentum, the swing to port, persisted. The bow was deep in the still water, acting as a pivot point. The stern, exposed to the current, continued to be pushed northward, rotating the ship further off course. We watched the distance to the northern breakwater decrease. The radar variable range marker indicated 150 meters, then 100. The visual perspective from the bridge wing was unforgiving. The gray concrete of the breakwater filled the view on the port side. 2 harbor tugs were waiting for us, but they were positioned well inside the basin, roughly half a mile away. They had been expecting a standard entry and were not in position to pass a line on the bow immediately. Even if they moved now, the time required to maneuver alongside and make fast a tow line was longer than the time we had before impact. We were on our own. The rate of turn indicator finally stopped climbing. It steadied, showing a constant swing to port. The rudder wash was fighting the current, but it had only achieved equilibrium, not a correction. We were not swinging faster, but we were still swinging towards the wall. The ship's speed over ground climbed to 6 knots. We were closing the distance to the hazard faster without having altered the direction enough to clear it. The master looked at the pilot. They communicated with short professional phrases. There was no shouting. "She's not coming back," the master stated. He was watching the jackstaff relative to a bollard on the breakwater. It was stationary, meaning a collision course. "We need to snub the bow," the pilot replied. "Starboard anchor." This was the only remaining option to generate a force capable of checking the swing. By dropping the starboard anchor and letting it drag along the bottom, a maneuver known as dredging, we could create resistance on the starboard bow. This drag would act as a brake on that side, pulling the bow to starboard and assisting the rudder. The master picked up the UHF radio. "Forward station, stand by starboard anchor. Prepare to let go." The chief officer on the bow replied instantly, "Standing by starboard anchor. Brake is open, held on the compressor. Let go. Deduct 1 shackle on deck, hold the brake," the master ordered. We heard the heavy rumble of the chain running out through the hawse pipe. It was a mechanical sound, distinct even over the engine vibration. "Anchor away," the chief officer reported. "Hold it," the master said. On the forecastle, the brake was tightened. The chain pulled tight. We needed the anchor to bite into the seabed but not hold fast. If it held fast at 6 knots, the chain would part or we would damage the windlass. We needed it to drag through the sediment, creating friction. The depth was 15 meters. The ship drew 13. There was very little chain out, just enough to touch bottom and drag the flukes. The ship shuddered slightly as the anchor caught the harbor mud. The chain rattled in the hawse pipe, but held. The effect on the ship's heading was not immediate. A ship of 70,000 tons does not change direction quickly. "Rudder still hard to starboard?" the pilot asked. "Hard to starboard," the helmsman confirmed. "Engine full ahead." We now had three forces working for us: the rudder deflecting the propeller wash, the propeller driving the ship forward to maintain flow over the rudder, and the starboard anchor dragging on the bottom to pull the bow to the right. Slowly, the jackstaff began to move. It shifted right, obscuring the breakwater bollard, then revealing the gap of open water. The rate of turn indicator dropped to 0, hesitated, and then began to show a swing to starboard. The bow was roughly 50 meters from the concrete blocks. It was close, but the movement was now correct. The stern was clearing the southern breakwater entrance, finally entering the protection of the harbor. As the stern entered the slack water, the pressure from the current vanished. Suddenly, the forces were unbalanced in the other direction. We had full rudder, full engine, and an anchor dragging on the starboard side, but the counterforce of the current was gone. The ship began to swing violently to starboard. "Midships," the pilot ordered, "stop engine." "Midships, stop engine," the helmsman and third officer repeated. The ship carried heavy way, nearly 7 knots now inside the harbor. We were swinging starboard, aiming towards the grain terminal, but moving much too fast. The anchor was still down, dragging and vibrating against the hull. What would you have done in a moment like this? The pilot needed to reduce speed immediately while controlling the new swing. "Port 20, the pilot said, "dead slow astern." This was a delicate command. Going astern on a right-handed propeller usually walks the stern to port, which pushes the bow to starboard. We were already swinging starboard. However, we needed to stop the vessel. The drag from the anchor was helping to slow us down, but the momentum was immense. The engine room answered the astern bell. The hull shuddered as the shaft rotation reversed. The wash from the propeller now worked against the rudder, reducing steering efficiency. "Pay out to 2 shackles," the master ordered the bow party. "Let it dredge." Giving more scope to the anchor allowed it to dig in slightly deeper, increasing the braking effect without shock loading the chain. The chief officer reported the chain was tight and leading aft. The anchor was acting as a stern tug on the bow, holding it back. The shear to starboard slowed as the engine kicked astern. The speed over ground dropped 5 knots, then 4. The vessel was now safely inside the breakwaters, roughly in the center of the turning basin, but we were misaligned for the berth and dragging ground tackle. The 2 tugs, which had been waiting near the berth, saw the situation. They accelerated toward us without waiting for a pilot order. They understood that a heavy ship moving at speed in the basin required immediate assistance. "Make the tugs fast, center lead forward and aft," the pilot said. We watched the speed drop further, 3 knots. The anchor chain was groaning under the tension, acting as the primary brake. The northern breakwater, which we had nearly struck, was now safely astern of us. The immediate danger of grounding or collision was past, but the vessel was in an awkward position, dragging an anchor in the middle of the port. The master exhaled a long breath. He looked at the electronic chart. We were clear of the shallow patches. The ship was floating freely, held only by the drag of the iron on the bottom. "Engine stop," the pilot ordered. The vibration ceased. The bridge became quiet again, save for the radio chatter from the tugs approaching our side. We drifted slowly in the center of the harbor, the starboard anchor chain acting as a tether, bringing the 70,000-ton mass to a gradual halt. The incident was over, but the work of getting alongside was just beginning. The immediate crisis had passed, but the vessel was now in a non-standard condition. We were drifting in the center of the harbor turning basin, effectively tethered to the bottom by the starboard anchor, with the main engine stopped. The silence on the bridge was a sharp contrast to the vibration of full power just moments before. The 2 harbor tugs arrived alongside. They were tractor tugs, agile and powerful. The pilot spoke into his UHF radio, reverting to the local language for a brief moment to give specific instructions, then switched back to English for the bridge team. "Make the forward tug fast on the center lead," the pilot instructed, "aft tug on the port quarter." The chief officer on the bow and the second officer on the stern acknowledged the orders. We watched from the bridge wing as the heaving lines were thrown. The heavy towing springs followed, dragged up through the chocks by the deck crew. Within 5 minutes, both tugs reported they were fast and ready to assist. With the vessel now under the control of the tugs, we could attend to the anchor. It had done its job as a brake, but we needed to recover it to proceed to the berth. "Heave up starboard anchor," the master ordered. On the forecastle, the hydraulics of the windlass whined as the gear took the strain. The chief officer reported the status of the chain continuously. Chain is tight, leading aft heavy strain. This was expected. We had been dragging the anchor through the harbor sediment. The pilot ordered the forward tug to push gently on the starboard bow to relieve the tension on the chain. Tug pushing easy power, the pilot said. Chain is vertical, up and down, the chief officer reported. Heave away, the master replied. The windlass pulled the anchor free from the mud. Anchor is away, came the report. The ship immediately felt different, lighter, drifting more freely with the wind. The constraint of the ground tackle was gone. Check the anchor is clear, the master said. Wash the chain thoroughly. We could see the thick gray harbor mud coating the links as they came up the hawse pipe. The deck crew used the fire line to blast the sediment away. Finally, the crown of the anchor appeared at the water's surface. Anchor is clear, no debris, the chief officer confirmed. Secure the anchor, the master said. With the ground tackle housed, the pilot resumed the approach to the grain terminal. The berth was located on the eastern side of the harbor. We were currently aligned roughly north-south, so we needed to turn the vessel and back it into the slot. Dead slow ahead, the pilot ordered. Helm amidships. The engine answered. We moved forward at 2 knots. The tugs positioned themselves to control our drift. The wind was still blowing from the northwest, pushing on our port beam. Aft tug, pull easy. Forward tug, push half. The ship began to rotate slowly to starboard. The movement was controlled and predictable. We were no longer fighting the hydrodynamics of the entrance. We were simply maneuvering in the basin. The rate of turn was steady. We approached the berth at a 45-degree angle. The pilot used the engine sparingly, relying on the tugs for fine adjustments. Stop engine. The vessel coasted. We were 200 meters from the quay. The line handlers were waiting on the dock. Dead slow astern. We needed to arrest the forward motion. The wash from the propeller bubbled up around the stern. The ship stopped in the water, parallel to the berth, about 30 meters off. Push both tugs, easy, the pilot commanded. The ship slid sideways toward the fenders. It is a slow process, pushing a Panamax vessel sideways against the wind. The bridge team monitored the distance on the Doppler log and visually from the wing. 20 meters, 10 meters, at 5 meters, the first heaving lines were thrown to the shore. Send the springs first, the master ordered. The heavy mooring lines were paid out. The shore gang placed the eyes over the bollards. The winches took up the slack. Touchdown, the pilot announced as the hull gently contacted the fenders. There was no jarring impact, just a soft settling against the rubber. Make fast fore and aft, 4 and 2, the master said. This meant 4 headlines and 2 springs forward and the same configuration aft. The winches tensioned the lines. The vessel was secure. The pilot verified the position with the loading master on the dock. We were centered on the manifold. Finished with engines, the master said. The third officer rang the telegraph. The engine room acknowledged. The vibrations ceased completely. The voyage was technically over. However, the master was not done. He picked up the telephone to the ship's office. Carpenter, sound all forward tanks. Forepeak, collision, bulkhead, number 1, double bottoms. Check for any water ingress. Although the chart said the harbor bottom was soft mud, and we had only dragged the anchor, not grounded the hull, it was necessary to verify. Dragging an anchor at 6 knots put significant stress on the windlass and the hull structure around the hawse pipe. The carpenter reported back 15 minutes later. All tanks dry. Soundings normal. No damage to the windlass mounting. Only then did the master relax. He walked to the chart table and signed the pilot's paperwork. "Thank you, pilot," the master said. "That was close." The pilot nodded, folding his copy of the receipt. "The current is strong today, stronger than the forecast." The incident was caused by a common but often underestimated hydrodynamic phenomenon known as the shear. When a long ship enters a harbor where a strong cross-current runs past the entrance, the bow enters the still water, while the stern is still being pushed by the current. The resulting couple creates a powerful turning moment that the rudder alone often cannot counter at slow speeds. In our case, the speed was the critical variable. We entered slowly to be safe, but the slow speed reduced the rudder's effectiveness. When we increase the speed to gain rudder power, we increase the risk of impact. The dredging anchor was the correct seaman-like response. It provided the pivot point we lacked and snubbed the bow's swing just enough to regain control. We discharged the grain cargo over the next 3 days without incident. During the departure, we took a tug made fast on the center lead aft before we even left the berth, keeping it until we were well clear of the breakwaters. The pilot explained that after our arrival, the Port Authority issued a temporary notice recommending that deep draft vessels utilize an escort tug for entry when the southerly current exceeded 2 knots. There was no damage to the ship, the cargo, or the port infrastructure. It was a near miss that appeared in no accident report, but it remained in the memory of everyone on the bridge that afternoon. It served as a reminder that the transition zone between open sea and sheltered harbor is often the most unstable part of a voyage. If you've seen something similar during your career, I'd like to hear it.